You're listening to The Artist Athlete, episode 135. This podcast is dedicated to CIRCUS. It's a place for professionals in the industry to share their stories, viewpoints, and information, and a place for outsiders to get a sneak peek into this world. Hey friends, fans, and foes. I'm Shannon McKenna, and I'm the host of the Artist Athlete podcast. This episode of the podcast, and every single episode of the podcast, is brought to you by Patreons, who are people just like you, except for they give small amounts of money every month to help me produce the podcast, which means they help me pay my amazing editor, Allison, Hannah, who is my assistant who helps me book all the guests and do all the things, and for hosting fees, equipment, and other things that come up. So if you love what you're listening to, you want to show your support, go to patreon.com/theartistathlete. It is the place to go. You can give as little as $1. Every single one is appreciated. And my goal is to get to 250 Patreons, which is not crazy considering how many of y'all download the podcast every single week. You know, that's a perfectly respectable portion of the people who do. However, I'm hovering around 177. So if 70, what's the math on that? I don't know. I don't want to do the math right now. But if a couple of y'all could just hop on patreon.com/theartistathlete, throw $1 my way. It's $12 a year, and you love what you're listening to. So, do the thing. Patreon.com/theartistathlete. Let's get into the episode. My God. My guest today is Yaron Lifschitz. Yaron is a graduate of the University of New South Wales, University of Queensland, and the National Institute of Dramatic Arts, NIDA, where he was the youngest director ever accepted into its prestigious graduate director's course. Since graduating, Yaron has directed over 60 productions, including large-scale events, opera, theater, physical theater, and circus. His work has been seen in 40 countries and across 6 continents by over 1.5 million people and has won numerous awards, including 6 Helpman Awards and the Australian Council Theatre Award. His productions have been presented at major festivals and venues all around the world, including the Brooklyn Academy of Music, the Barbican, Les Nuits des Fauvières, Chameleon, and all the major Australian festivals. His film work was selected for the Berlin and Melbourne Film Festivals. He was founding artistic director at the Australian Museum's Theatre Unit, head tutor in directing at Australian Theatre for Young People, and has been a regular guest tutor in directing at NIDA. He is currently artistic director and CEO of the circus company, Circa, and that's what I wanted to talk to him about today. Full disclosure, friends, fans, and foes, I'm not a fan of Circa, but I respect their work. I think it has a strong point of view, and clearly there's some methodology behind it, but it is wildly different to so many, even contemporary circus companies that I enjoy. I have friends and have interviewed many people who have worked for the company. You can see that list in the show notes. And every time there's a circus show in a city I'm in, I see it. In fact, I think that aside from Cirque du Soleil, I've seen more Circa shows than any other circus company. So walking into this interview, I really wanted to understand what is going on in Yaron's mind, because for some reason, even though I don't like it, I'm clearly obsessed with it. And now after speaking to him, I think I know why. There are a couple of responses that Yaron gives that I think need some context, so I'm going to be interjecting from time to time, much in the style of Ali Ward and her fabulous podcast, Ologies. And the reason I'm interjecting is to give you some definitions and context and origin stories of what I believe are the philosophical inspiration for Yaron's work in Circa, and thus why this company is what it is. I don't know if I'm successful. You can be the judge of that. In any case, here's my interview with Yaron Lifschitz.
Can I ask, are you in the bathroom?
It's the best sound in the house.
Yeah, and if you've had too much the night before, you can always just open the lid and
Exactly, just kind of lean on the side and just
it's perfect. Yeah, well done, well played.
All right, let's do it. Yaron Lifschitz.
Yep. Hello.
Welcome to the Artist Athlete podcast.
Thank you very much.
Yay. Okay, so starting out, Who are you? What do you do?
So my name's Yaron Lifschitz. I'm the artistic director of a company called Circa, which is a small circus company based down here on the other side of the world in Brisbane, Australia. I've been doing this since 2000 or since 1999. We've been Circa since 2004, and we make a circus that is fairly kind of stripped back, contemporary. We do a lot of different things with circus. We say that our purpose, our function on this planet is to ask what is possible in circus, which is, of course, a question that you can never really answer, or there is no single answer for. And that's what makes it so exciting.
Yeah, I have a ton of questions about Circa and your whole methodology and approach. But before that, I was reading your Wikipedia page, like the good journalist I am. It says that you grew up in South Africa to parents of Eastern European descent. In your time in South Africa, growing up, like what was your relationship to live performance? Were you in theater, dance, circus? Like what did that look like?
No,
as a
I left
kid?
South Africa when I was 10, and I'd seen
Okay.
a youth circus, which I remember loving, but don't remember what it was. And I'd seen a production of Annie, the musical, which I'd slept through and had never been so bored in my life.
In
And that
South
pretty much,
Africa?
yeah, and that pretty much set the bandwidth, the kind of bowling alley gutters for my life, which is being mostly very bored by sitting in a theater watching people say, sing, and act things that they weren't, that they didn't come up with, that I didn't believe in, and occasionally finding these moments of genuine excitement and frisson and falling in love with something, which is what I remember happening at the circus. I have actually no recollection of what it was. I was probably about 6 or 7, but there was something I really loved. But most of the time in the theater, and dirty secret, I don't think I'm alone here. I'm just bored.
For sure. I mean, we all know how Hamlet ends, right?
Yeah, well, exactly.
No, I mean, like, yeah.
Yeah, 4
No, I
hours
feel
after
you.
it begins and about $120 later, generally.
Spoiler alert, they all
Yeah,
die.
spoiler alert.
So how did you know when you found those moments, though? Like, where something was genuine or true? Like, what popped out at you? Was it physical from the get-go?
No, and it's still not physical. I'm interested in a kind of poetry by which I think I mean something very different to things that are mellifluous and soft and lovely. I think by poetry I mean a kind of intensified experience, and I don't really mind where that comes from. It can come from words. It can come from physical action in the theatre. I work in opera, and I find it often to me comes from the voice. I work with symphony orchestras and chamber musicians, and I often find that the vibration of a string, the kind of that way that music talks directly to you in a kind of abstract and mysterious way, are profoundly moving. I don't think it matters much what language you use. I think it matters what you say and how you manage to get it received.
What do you think that circus can say that these other art forms can't?
I'm really very reluctant to kind of promote any kind of exceptionalism, whether that's about people or genres or languages. The way I see it, it's very much like a language. English speakers, Norwegians, and Swahilian speakers don't walk around saying, wow, we've got the best language and we're really beautifully capable of doing this. What they do is they try and express what's happening inside them, their relationship to their world, and they do that better or worse. And every great language, I think, every language has its moment of poet. It has its founding kind of people who open the language up over the course of its development, and it's not stable. But it's the actual form is much less interesting than what you do with it. I work in circus for a couple of reasons. I like the people. They seem to me to be smart, and they aren't full of bullshit. I like the fact that you can ask them to do really tough things and they're happy to do them most of the time. I like the fact that they're self-reliant, and nobody gets involved in circus because they want to get told what to do by somebody else, which always astounds me when I see people learning what I think most of the time is fairly ordinary choreography and bad acting to complement their exceptional skill base, and think, wow, you've really, you're learning a lot of moves that you really probably don't need to be there to do this thing that you've spent a lot of time mastering. And I think for me, I'm interested in that element of mastery and self-mastery. And yeah, I like the fact that you don't have to talk a lot. Like I trained as a theatre director. I've got a degree in creative writing, but I choose to work at a medium that almost always, for me at least, is wordless. And I like that. I like the restriction. I like the, if you think about a handstand, it's a highly restricted way of getting vertical. I mean, you're just going to do it on one or two hands. But effectively, there's lots easier ways to get vertical, but it's the restriction that makes it difficult and also makes it rewarding and possibly beautiful or funny or something else. So again, it comes back to how you speak the language that you have rather than what is the language. But yeah, I mean, for me, circus is it's thoroughly real. There's this line, Andy Warhol said once that sex and parties, the two things that you still need to be there for. I think circus is a legitimate third. You can't kind of say, oh, I was at this great circus show and they did this thing. It really doesn't. I mean, it might mean something to a circus insider, but phenomenologically, it's not the experience. The experience is that circus is at its core, its dramaturgy. If you strip it back and remove the lycra and the moving lights or the urban we're so cool posturing, what it is at its core is it's a dramaturgy of the audience's heartbeat. And we're talking very directly to that. And it very much is like, a sex or a party. A DJ doesn't play songs for the sake of it. They play songs to manipulate the audience's heartbeat. I'm sure everybody who's old enough and of age will know what happens in sex, but effectively it's about a relationship between your heartbeat and somebody else's, your body's rhythm and somebody else's, and how they affect and dance and wrestle and push and negotiate each other. And that's exactly what happens in circus. So by its essence, if you don't clutter it too much, it's deeply authentic and can be very profound. I mean, it can also be just a bunch of tricks, and there's nothing wrong with that. I like to think that I've spent 20 plus years figuring out how low a level of entertainment circus can possibly have in it. And sometimes I fail at that, but I'm not particularly interested in entertaining audiences. I think that there's plenty of people who do that much better than me.
I have so many questions about what you just said. I guess the first one is, if you're not trying to be entertaining, why do you think that your shows are produced in so many different theaters and people come to see them?
Well, sometimes we fail. In fact, most of the time we fail. Sometimes you just
unfortunately you were too entertaining.
Too entertaining by mistake. No, look, I mean, I don't mean to sound, completely Belgian about this. We had a Belgian intern once, and she came out and said, "But why do you care that the audience like it?" I'm like, well, if our dramaturgy is the audience's heartbeat, an audience whose heart is not beating is clearly not engaged with us. I'm not talking about lack of engagement. I'm not talking about lack of connection. What I'm talking about is not giving the audience just the satisfaction of the pure thrill and experience of circus. Because we all know that at the end of the day, that lasts 5 minutes in an hour-long show. Right? The question really is, what do you do with the other 55 minutes? You can fill that. You can fill that with choreography. You could fill that with pretending that you can't do the trick. You could fill that with acting. You can fill that with things. I have no interest in any of that. I came for that 5 minutes, and I want to ask, how do I extend that 5 minutes into an hour or whatever that is? And then if I add that, how do I take that essence and infuse it through other mediums or other ways of connecting? It's kind of like, I always feel like the dominant. If circus was a restaurant, most of the time it would only serve dessert.
Oh my God, I love that. I also love dessert, so.
And I love dessert. Don't get me wrong. You can tell by looking at my very unathletic artist body that I'm like dessert far too much. But I don't like it in my theatre, or don't only like it in my theatre. I think it's about a third to a quarter of the meal. It's not where you get your nutrition from. It's not where you get your meaning from. And one of the things that I really learnt over the course of COVID that the last couple of years has taught me is that I can get really good entertainment watching bad TV. I can get it playing with my dog. I can get it doing lots of things. I don't need the expense, the inconvenience, the risk of going into the theatre for that. I need to go to the theatre because I need to sit in a room with other human beings and have some kind of profound and empathetic experience where my insides and their insides talk to each other, where we are connecting, and I think theatre has its basis not in literature, not in drama, not in kind of themes and about. It has its basis in ritual. It has its basis in religion, in gathering, and that's where it's most powerful. And now that can also entertain you. There's nothing wrong with being entertained. But if entertainment is the leading, the driving, and the end, they like the show. They clapped at me. My ego is sated. But they leave and they're unmoved. They leave and they are the same people who walked into that dark, expensive, out of the way, needing a babysitter, drive through the snow, whatever it is that makes it difficult to go to the theatre kind of room. And I traveled the world to get there, and the audience leaves and they're the same people. Then we failed. And I don't want to come to fail. So, I mean, there's a part of me that goes, we tour shows around the world and we are fairly prolific, or fairly wide, well distributed, because on one hand, we have an okay amount or a reasonable amount of entertainment. But I also like to think that we tour as widely as we do because audiences crave something deeper. And by deeper, I don't mean, and I'll slander everyone in the course of this podcast, and I can't help myself, but I do kind of feel there is that particular genre of French circus where you just talk about how you're not going to do the trick because it's so philosophical and poetic, and even though you've got all these wicked skills, you're far too cool to actually do any acrobatics. We're not talking about deep like that. I mean deep from the actual experience of doing the thing. And circus is just inherently a brilliant live art form. You have to be there. You have to do the thing. And that moment is rich and I think philosophically incredibly dense. Like I can't see myself ever doing more than scratching the surface of how we can, just bring some of those flavors into a theatrical moment with the audience.
How influenced are you by the work of like a Jerzey Growtowski or some of these other Eastern European theater makers? Because I feel like what you're talking about is very his philosophy and work. Okay, hi, Shannon from the future here. So, in this question, I really dusted off my overpriced theater degree to ask Yaron how much he was influenced by famous Polish theater director Jerzey Grotowski. Grotowski's method, which is described in the manifesto Towards the Poor Theater, was to strip away all costumes, set design, and other markers and spectacle from theater and focus solely on the relationship between the actor and the audience. Lots of bare stages, and I hold him responsible for all those contemporary circus and modern dance companies out there that call black booty shorts and sports bras a costume. However, in place of these superficial austerities was supposed to be this meaningful, visceral connection from the performers to the audience that the audience would acquire through observing and sometimes participating in some sort of ritualistic action during or with the show, the hope being they would take these feelings of connectivity into their own lives. Grotowski saw the theater as having the potential for being a catalyst for social justice and change, and I think that's pretty dope, so much so that I absolutely forgive him for the legacy of lazy costuming. Here's Yaron's answer.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think everybody My generation was heavily influenced by Growtowski and Eugenia Barber and the kind of the great Eastern European directors that came after, that followed in their footsteps. I spent a fair bit of time seeing theatre in Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic and Berlin, of course. Look, I think in some way we're all children of Artaud, and I think that the Anton Artaud is the kind of progenitor of kind of non-drama theatre. But, I'm not interested in covering myself in blood and screaming.
Okay, let's not skip by this Artaud reference. Before Jerzey Grotowski, in the early 1900s, there was a theater director named Anton Artaud, which is spelled Artaud because that's how French works. Artaud was all about shock value. During his shows, he would add things like violent flashing lights, or as Yaron alluded to, he would dump fake blood all over his audience. His goal was not to make his audience comfortable, obviously, but rather to wake them up and force them to intensely face what he called the cruelty of life. If Artaud was alive today, I feel like he would go viral a lot for doing really shocking things and probably get canceled on the internet. Artaud was a pretty intense dude who loved heroin and was institutionalized on multiple occasions for complications from too many psychedelics, but he's also cited as one of the greatest theater philosophers of the 20th century, so goals?
There's a lot of boring theatre was made and a lot of desperately self-important and not very good theatre was made in the Eastern Bloc countries at the same time as some incredibly profound and moving theatre was made. What I took predominantly from watching actors, I had friends who trained under people who were associated with Cantor, and I worked with some Polish actors in Sydney, some ex-refugee actors, and what I took from them was just their ability it was like a national sport. They were incredibly physically and emotionally committed. I used to have to keep getting them to do less because they would be running around bringing ideas and bringing kind of intensity that was extraordinary, but often wasn't necessarily right for the show that I was making. I think it's a very interesting part. It's very different to a kind of Anglo sort of WASP meets Broadway kind of tradition, which is very much based in theatre. And I think it's why a show like Annie would still put me to sleep, no matter how well and how beautiful the artists are. And one great song that plays a lot. But I didn't come from a theatre background. I didn't act, I didn't dance, I didn't sing. I was never seduced by tutus and sequins. It just wasn't my thing. So I didn't come to it from that perspective, and it probably shows. That's kind of why my work is often, I think, visually quite drab. I'm not sort of just often don't see. I mean, it took me years before I really could even think about what costumes people were wearing. I just didn't understand that was a thing.
To be honest, when you wrote and you suggested that I think it was your wife or some of the costumer for Circa, I interviewed them. I was like, I wasn't aware that was a role in the company.
Yeah, well, luckily I am actually married to the person who designs almost all of our costumes. And they've become incredibly sophisticated, but they are kind of, the level of sophistication is how do you find exactly the right thing and make your work in exactly the right way whilst making it look like mostly it doesn't exist most of the time. Because I'm really not interested in, like when I say I'm not interested, it makes it sound like I'm dismissing. I think one of the great things about any artistic pursuit is that there are so many different visions and so many different forms. And I think it's really good that there are people like, Cirque du Soleil who use all the lycra that needs to be on a stage anywhere in the world, and they do that beautifully. And I'm glad because I don't feel like I'm under the need to do that. If anything, the thing that frustrates me is the work that looks too much like Circa. I've never wanted Circa to be a style. I feel like quite a lot of the time at the moment I'm running to clear space between me and people who looked like our work a couple of years ago. That's the space I don't want to, I definitely don't want to compete with facsimile ghosts of myself.
Oh, hey there. I just wanted to interrupt this interview real quick to just say one real quick little thing about myself, which is that I am not only the host of the Artist Athlete podcast. No. She is a businesswoman, and I run a whole company dedicated to the education and inspiration of circus artists. That goes from people who are just doing it, weekend warriors, as a hobbyist, recreationally, or if you're a professional, you've put in the hours and you need more resources. Go to theartistathlete.com. There are a ton of recorded workshops, online manuals and ebooks, everything you could possibly need from me and from some guests on this show about everything from nutrition to training your shoulders to really specific aerial moves that you need to master. Again, theartistathlete.com. And just because you went there from listening to this podcast, use code PODCAST and get 15% off your entire purchase. That's right. Theartistathlete.com. Use code PODCAST at checkout for 15% off your entire purchase. And have a great day. Back to the episode. Yeah. And I mean, I guess the question there is, how do you evolve, or how do you do that?
My practice is very much based on asking questions. So every show starts with some questions that the previous show or shows or something in our thinking raised. So I'm in the middle of working on a creation now. We open in a couple of weeks, and it comes out of reflecting on the last few shows that have all been very much group acrobatic based and focused. And I wanted to not do that. And that's a very difficult space, because when you have a group of warm acrobatic artists, you kind of want to keep them all doing stuff. So just kind of naturally the room tends towards there's a group of people all doing things, and therefore they all become, and if 4 people do something but you can have 8, or 10, they'll do more stuff, and there'll be more spotters, and you can find interesting pathways, and it's beautiful. But I didn't want that as an architect.
And Circa meets at the intersection of like Towards the Poor Theater, Growtowski-based ensemble work, you know, from your influences, and Australian acrobatics, which is notoriously group acrobatics.
It's notoriously group acrobatics. I mean, a lot of that stemmed from Circa. Like when I started, it was the Australian house style was Circus Oz, which was larrikin humor, quite heavily apparatus based, and focused a lot on essentially mostly the same joke, which was I can't do it. Oh, look, I did it. And that kind of repeated, and some social commentary. And we took that away in the first couple of shows that we made as we came out of being Rock and Roll Circus into Circa. And Rock and Roll Circus, which existed in parallel to Circus Oz as the kind of adult thing, had some very fine acrobats in it, and some of them would travel between Circus Oz and Rock and Roll Circus. But the interesting thing about all of those acrobats was that the acrobatics were always numbers in shows still. So they were always like, we'll do hand-to-hand, we'll do group pyramids, we'll do blah. That was always and even if the show, like some of Rock and Roll Circus is really good, really strong early sort of work, The Dark and Body Slam, were more through composed. They still sat as skill effectively in the place of where an acrobat, where a trapeze routine or a piece of, a bungee number might be. There'd be a kind of acrobatic number. And what we did at Circa was say, let's rethink that whole model. And we started to do that many years ago. But the first show that anyone saw from that was The Space Between, where we just took 3 people, stripped them right back, built acrobatics, and made the acrobatics the actual kind of, rather than it being the journey that the fish swam on, we made it the water. The actual show was built. The languages the show were built in were acrobatics, not acrobatics were things people did in a show built about something else. And that style, which you can now see through Cass's, Gravity and Other Myths, By Thread, kind of almost any number of companies, that wasn't a self-perpetuating Australian thing. That was a thing we created.
And so now you have the language. The fish has come out of the water and become a
Well, exactly. We now have to evolve into something.
And then the question becomes like, how do you evolve from there? Or what does that
and everyone, of course, loves your early work, and everyone thinks, you have You have
That's
the
awful.
constant battle between what people expect, what they want. The show doesn't have enough group acrobatics, and all of that, or has too much, or it has apparatus, or it doesn't, or I like, and you can go nuts trying to end game that. I think you try and you have to be aware of it, and none of us are kind of naive. But I think what's much more important is that you are making authentic, necessary work with the artists who can bring them their full selves to that stage, to that world. And then you just kind of, hope it doesn't suck.
What helps you do that? Tune out those expectations or be aware of them, but proceed anyway. Do you have any practices or anything you do, or do you just have a pint at the end of the day and just keep pushing?
I don't like casting very much, so I tend to work with the same people for a long time, which means that any change, any change is incremental. As you know, circus is a slow medium to evolve skill. You can learn a new role in opera very quickly, but to learn a new discipline might take 6 months or 6 years, or you might never excel in it. I remember watching one of the finest acrobats we've ever worked with try and learn Chinese pole, and we'd given a period of about 6 months. And they were good in the end, but we had artists who were significantly less impressive natural acrobats who could still far outperform this person on pole. It's not like it's a very slow evolving medium. So there's a baseline of there's only a certain amount of newness you can expect in a creation period, unless you want to recast, and that's not my way. So we have to deal with that. That automatically means everything else should be under some degree of pressure to kind of advance the conversation, break the mold, try something different, because your medium, if you're working with a roughly consistent group of people, is going to be your physical bandwidth is going to be fairly narrow. That's not unusual. I mean, ballet dancers don't wake up in the morning and say, I wonder if I can reinvent my whole ballet language. They just kind of keep perfecting it and add some things and then order it in different ways and mix a bit of something else in, and you have a new ballet. Like it's not, you don't need a huge expressive apparatus to be incredibly powerful. I mean, if you think about Western art music, all the kind of classical music from Bach to 20th century is created with 12 semitones. It's just 12 black dots. That's all it is. It's just how you arrange 12 black dots that makes the difference.
And so for you in this metaphor, the 12 black dots are the acrobats that you have on stage and what you have
the
them
acrobats
do?
and their kind of their range of things. What I do well is challenge them to be not their usual selves. And again, it feels
Can
feels
you give
very
an
much
example of this? Because I have an example in my head of stories that I've heard of you. I have a friend who you once asked to do an 8-minute Chinese pole act.
Yeah, it's a beautiful piece of music, and I really wanted to feel it. I mean, years ago, Jerzey, who went on to create Company 2 and now Company Chelsea McGuffin, did a point routine which was based on how long she could just stay on point for. Turned out to be quite long, but not everything's durational. A really basic thing that we do is we say, how do you get into a too high without using your hands? Hands in acrobatics are very important to me because they're kind of the equivalent of consciousness. As soon as a hand goes for something, it's telling a story. So if you don't use your hands or you remove the importance of your hands, you vastly change the story. When someone's dying on stage, an audience's eyes always go to their hand as the last thing. The hand releasing is the final moment of death on stage. We have a sense that this is our kind of physical equivalent of our tongue. Our tongue moving is a hand opening and closing or grasping or releasing. And we do there's a lot of that in acrobatics. So if you restrict that or give that certain rules, you can only use the back of your hand, or I want you to maintain 2 points of contact. These are very physical things. But I work from, if you kind of look at life, go to a cafe, it's not art. What you need to make it art is to put a frame around it. You might want to select a particular part of it. You might want to take a photo and take out the element of movement. You might want to take out the element of color and make it black and white. You might want to zoom in and take out the element of perspective or add something else in. But effectively, that kind of framing and removing is what tends to extract the art. It's kind of like, you've got to squeeze the grape to get the juice. It's just kind of as a grape, it's just like a piece of fruit. If you want wine, you've got to concentrate it and ferment it and allow it to do its thing. I should say I know nothing about winemaking, but I'm assuming that's what happens.
Yeah, and I actually, you kind of lost me there. I was with you with the life isn't art. What you choose to put a frame around becomes art, and you become the artist, right? You show someone else that I framed this thing, and that's
you've got to frame it. Yeah,
how you
and
make
so
art.
and by framing it, you have to you give yourself the chance to extract some kind of juice, some kind of meaning, some kind of emotion from that thing. If you do it right, the presence of a frame doesn't guarantee art. It's not a kind of reverse truth. You can whack frames around things and just be, a carpenter. It's about selection, but a frame is essentially a restriction. I'll give you a really simple example. When I teach at dance schools, and I know nothing about dance, and I find the kind of radical cleanliness of like teaching at Titch Dance School or Northern School of Contemporary Dance in Leeds quite confronting. There's all these very shiny people, and they all kind of look like they have all these beautiful pathways, and they do this amazing stuff. And I don't know any of that. So I asked them to cross the floor from one side of the room to the other without their feet touching the floor. And what's interesting is some will roll, some will stay on other people, some will do things. But suddenly, from what would have just been a walk, there's a whole variety of forms. Now, if I asked them to cross the floor without any restriction, they could have done all of that. Right? There's nothing. I didn't add any information. I actually just stopped them doing a lot of their ordinary things, and that's the essence, I think, of almost any of my practice, is to create moments of resistance or challenge, and we call those things languages.
What do you find you like to frame? What parts of life?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not the type of framing that I do by itself interesting. So I'm interested in the emotion it creates. The emotions that I want to create are essentially emotions that don't yet have names. You have a name for happy and sad. I don't need to tell you that. I want you to feel something and say, that feels like an emotion that's at the core of humans. I felt this feeling, and I never quite felt that feeling before. Now, clearly, I'm not going to do that very often, and I'm not going to do that to most people most of the time. So I'm not.
Or maybe it's not even novel, but it precedes words, right?
Absolutely.
There's a viscerality to it.
Look, I think that's true, but I do think there's a concept. I used to work in museums many years ago, and there's a thing called a holotype, which is the thing that describes a species. So you'll have a given fish, and if you think you have a fish that's the same fish, you write to the people who've got the holotype and say, is it one of these? Let's compare it, or let's look at some DNA. So somewhere like there's a jar of the thing. Sorry?
So like an invention, you get a patent for it to say like, this is the thing and this is how it's constructed. But
yeah.
So a holotype would be like that for animals? Is that what
yeah, it's sort of like that, but it's just like the one that describes the species. It's the first one that they've found and have kind of catalogued. So for me, I'm interested in kind of the holotype of emotions. I'm not particularly interested in creating things that people already know. And I do feel like we're very emotionally blunt as a species. We tend to have, like, if you look at the range of facial expressions and kind of emotional bandwidth of Emily in Paris, you'll see somebody who, there's kind of laugh and cry and like there's this kind of range, and it's very attractive and very seductive because that's exactly, we can all register those on a kind of almost infantile level, like they're happy, they're sad, they're this. But what about those feelings that feel much more complex and rich and pre-verbal, like you say? And those are the things that I think performance can meaningfully talk to. They are not simple. They're not binary.
To support Yaron's claim, sociologist Brené Brown surveyed 7,000 people and found that the average number of emotions that people could identify was 3: happy, sad, and angry. In her book, Atlas of the Heart, she goes on to identify and define 86 distinct emotions that people experience, including stress, dread, fear, confusion, regret, despair, anguish, compassion, joy, shame, disgust, amusement, pride, and loneliness, just to name a few. Anne Bogart writes this really great essay that comes to mind about like seeing E.T. and walking out of the theater and feeling very emotionally manipulated by Steven Spielberg. Because even though she cried at the end of the movie, that was the way that Steven Spielberg wanted her to feel.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And so with the kind of art that I think you're aspiring to make, you want that maybe not everybody in the audience has the same emotional experience or digs into the same thing, but everybody has a point of something. Yes?
Yeah.
You said the word manipulate earlier in terms of like relationship with audience.
We definitely manipulate, but I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that much more like a kind of physiotherapist way. An osteopathic way. We kind of we open up pathways. We crack things that need to be cracked. That sometimes after that crack, I love an acrobat standing in the corner of the room with somebody else's arms wrapped around them in something that looks like a hug. And then you hear an audible crack, and then the next response might be laughter or it might be tears. That's what we do. That's a manipulation. We're actually moving something. I don't know whether it's going to result in laughter or tears, and hopefully it results in some new kind of form that nobody's quite got before. I want people to walk away and go, I don't know what that was, but I felt it. A new flavor has been added to my emotional taste buds. That would be ideal. And hopefully that's part of it. Part of those flavors is to say, are they flavors that promote the kind of world that I think my work is aiming to do, which is a world which is fragile and strong. It's interdependent. It's sensitive, and yet it's unafraid to be tough and brutal. It's a kind of, I think fundamentally a kind of an ethical stance, which is it's not based in making a point. It's based in that there are certain ways to be in the world that are just strike me as being ethically preferable to others. And I'd like to make those possible. One of the things a young artist will often do is we improvise a lot. And in improvisation, they'll push another artist. That's completely banned at Circa. I mean, unless I'm trying to make a show about kindergartens, which I'm not. It's juvenile. It's a way of expressing something. If that's the level that you can express it at, it probably shouldn't be on a stage performed by grown-ups. People who come to our work and observe our process or observe our processes and want to write essays about them or explain them come from dance and they say, oh, your work is very task-based. So you're doing tasks. The thing about tasks is a good choreographer looks at someone, says, now I want you to write your own name with your left hand upside down as if you're moving through treacle, and you do that. And then they say, I really like this bit that you did, right? And they find a particular part, and then they use that as a phrase. I don't work that way at all. I work with languages which are generative structures. So if the task is I'm trying to think of one from the current show, the task is to find multiple ways that you can be on somebody rapidly, quickly disengaging and not having any stages of climbing up onto them. So you just kind of land on them and come off and land on them and come off, right? I'm not interested in taking the 12 best seconds of that and making a piece out of it. I want you to learn to be inside that language and to learn how to speak it. And I want you to infuse it with yourself, with your relationship, with your understanding of the show, with philosophy, with poetry, whatever kind of, floats your boat, and bring yourself to that and make that interesting. And the ones that are the most interesting or rich or kind of full of life are the ones that I will land up putting on stage. But they're not sealed. They're not that is now all they are. You get on stage and you actually have to live inside that task, not recreate that out of form. Therefore, the shows constantly need to change because they're going to be richer if you're creating it from the inside. But also it means that cognitively you have to work in a very different way. There's things coming at you. There's multiple challenges. And so your body is working hard and your brain is working hard and you're getting this full body, brain, heart kind of engagement that creates a sort of presence, I think, in the work, which you can't meaningfully perform Circa's work as a series of moves and numbers and skills. It just doesn't work.
How do you do that with a group? Is it that you don't ever set choreography and that you just always have these restrictions or prompts or what languages? Is that
it very much varies
you're using?
Yeah, look, it very much varies from show to show. Some shows are quite fixed. Some shows are quite are really open. I love finishing a show with a lengthy improvised sequence, because I think, it's great when the cast have to kind of look at themselves and say, we have to bring this home. Like, we have to figure out how to bring what happened tonight to that point with an audience. But many of them don't end that way because it's wrong for the show, or I couldn't think of the right way to do that. Again, there's no single formula that works. Some shows are improvised or have just room for play throughout. Some shows are very significantly improvised. A much bigger part is calibrating all the performers so that they are artistically calibrated to the work, to each other, and to the kind of way that Circa works. That's really hard. So you can have a performer who's got all the skills and never excels in the work, and you can have a performer who gets it instantly. And usually it takes, 3 to 12 months before they look like they know what they're doing on a Circa stage, which is a long time.
For artists who want to work with Circa, how do you cast? Are you at a point now where you can tell the people who, skilled or not, will get the work in the way you're talking about?
I hate casting. It's like dating without the wine. It just kind of it's you have to put yourself out there. You have to say to somebody, do you want to come and spend the next couple of years working with me and working with us, often on the other side of the world, on work that's going to be incredibly difficult. I mean, Circa's work is very physically demanding. It's demanding because there's often whole shows where you never get to decontract. You never get to go off stage. Your pathways are activated. So doing simple things, doing great skills, once you learn how to do them, get easier because the pathway gets biomechanically more efficient. You're using less cognitive energy and emotional energy to achieve them. And so therefore, after a while, they become easier. Our work never becomes easier. It just gets harder in different ways. And I'm interested in effort. I'm interested in the pleasure that comes with effort. So when you're casting, you're actually saying to someone effectively, do you want to enter a kind of very challenging relationship? Probably, and our average length of stay is probably now close to 8 years, I would say. People don't generally go.
Wow.
So to do that for a long time is difficult, and therefore it does always feel like you're in this really awkward kind of dating phase where you're like, you look like somebody I'm interested in working with. Am I interested in something? You're someone interested in working with. Are we going to find each other? And like dates, they don't all end well. Circa's very different. There's in a couple of things. One, we cast people. They work in an ensemble. That ensemble learns multiple shows. So they will often take on a single 2 or 5 different shows with them. And some of those shows you'll have to learn.
Wow, wait a second. How? Do you guys have like notation like you would in music or
It's pretty bad.
Do you
It's pretty bad. There's like a bunch of videos that you can sort of half see what's going on. There's a bunch of like, so I don't know if things circus artists love to call things really obscure things. So this is the, flying taxidermy into the moisty sequence into the, like all this stuff. Yep. So you've got all that and there's a list and there's a track, but it's very vague. To use an example, we started a team in the middle of the year. We had 4 new artists based out of Riga and we took 7 from Australia. This was in the end of May 2021. So right in the middle of COVID. They just got back last week. So they've been away since then. They went and we made an opera in Lyon. We went to the UK and did Tubular Bells, which is another new creation. Then they went to Berlin and they did 4 shows in repertoire. Then they went to America and they added another show. So they did in Berlin, they did Humans 2.0, What Will Have Been, and Peep Show. Then we got to America and 3 or 4 shows in, we opened Circa. So in the course of that, they did 7 shows, different shows. Yeah.
I'm so tired. That's incredible.
Yeah. I think that is the dominant thing. Most circus artists go, I think at the end of every day of anyone doing circus in the world, they feel tired. That's physically tired. I think at Circa, they feel mentally tired as well. I like that. I actually enjoy that feeling. I like the feeling that there's no room for, you've had to give it everything. And I think at certain stages of kind of energy and engagement, different things become possible. People say, I couldn't do that. And you're like, well, how do you know? How do you know you couldn't do it? Have you ever tried it? I think we're far more capable than we tend to think.
Based on what Yaron has described so far, I believe that this place where he aspires his acrobats to go, where they are each day pushed to physical, mental, and emotional tiredness, takes its inspiration from what that old Polish theater director Growtowski calls the exploration of exhaustion. Here's a passage from writings of actor Thomas Richards about one of Grotowski's rehearsals. He says, quote, "We danced for a long time. It seemed we must have been going for some hours non-stop. After a certain point, my physical exhaustion grew. My mind became tired and quiet. It was less able to tell my body how to interpret the song. Then, for some short moments, I felt as if my body started to dance by itself. The body led the way to move. The mind became passive." Now, to be clear, I don't think Yaron wants total exhaustion or a passiveness in the mind, since in circus that can be really dangerous. And as I listened back to this interview, I'm kind of kicking myself for not asking how he finds that line between driving his acrobats to exhaustion and also ensuring that the way they rehearse and perform is safe and sustainable for their bodies.
The other thing that's different about Circa is we pay people differently. So we pay people all year round. So they get paid regardless of whether they do shows or not. And they get paid through holidays, they get paid through sickness. So we have a kind of model. After a time at the company, they get paid a little bit more when they do shows. It's a kind of sweetness.
It's almost like a repertory model, like a rep theater or something like that.
Well, people are committing to be here. That's essentially what we're paying them for, is to be here. Same as me. I'm an employee, and we're all kind of doing this thing and choosing to spend our time here. And that's why we do that. We should get paid to do that because we're not doing things outside or only sporadic things. And it's a different way of being. So therefore, it doesn't work well for people who just like to do the same thing over and over and over again. That they're not our target employees.
Yeah, when you were talking about circus show, like during a circus show, you're on the whole time. I'm thinking about all of the times that I've shown up, done my act, and gone out and got a sandwich, and then come back to take a bow. You know?
Oh, look, I think there's a lot of circa artists who'd be very envious of that. And it also depends very much on your skill set. Like if you perfect an act and you get really amazing at something, then you have every right to just joyously and wholeheartedly share that with the world. And Circa's a pretty bad place to do that. I mean, there are certain shows that do that. What Will Have Been is a really great example. It's probably our physically toughest show. It's 3 artists and it goes for 60 minutes and it opens with an 8-minute rope or straps routine, depending on who did it. Lauren Hurley created the first version and Kim Rossi now does it on straps. And right in the middle, there's a double kind of trapeze routine. It's a single point trapeze routine performed by the 2 men that goes for 15 minutes or 13 minutes, but neither of them are trapeze artists. And it's just kind of brutal. It's quite extraordinary to watch because there is no form. There's hardly any tricks exactly. And he just sort of goes there. It kind of rips the layers of kind of skin and understanding, kind of protection of them until eventually there's just these two very tired and intense bodies kind of slamming into each other. It was great having something like Lauren's rope routine, which is an incredibly high-skilled, perfected rope routine, and it's beautiful to watch. But it's still doing that for 8 minutes is not the ideal way to show your wares to the world.
No. Yeah, especially if then you have another 52 minutes
of kind
ahead of you on stage.
Really intense work. Really intense work. But again, like circus. One of the great things about circus artists is that they're good at doing stuff and they don't mind. There's no show me the great circus artist that doesn't have a strain of masochism about them. Like there has to be something that loves pain. Otherwise you wouldn't do it.
It's true.
So,
it's true.
So that's, and that if you need the masochistic side of you indulged, then Circa is a particularly good place to do that.
That should be on all of your casting forms.
Look, to be honest, we work very, very long and hard to find the right people. They also need to have some kind of fire inside them, some kind of dark, unresolved something. I generally work much better with introverts than extroverts. So the Circa rehearsal room, often doesn't feel like there's any art happening. It's just a bunch of people walking around doing stuff. There's very little showbiz. I'm not good at showbiz. I never really understood it. And it's really focused. We're a company that's, just kind of put your energy where it counts. Don't waste time and energy. Don't squander it on things that don't matter. Focus it and be really precise. And this, to work at that pitch only suits a pretty small number of people, to be honest. There's just not that many. We always have more roles than we feel like we can fill.
On the topic of casting, we've actually met before in person in Montreal, and there's no reason that you should remember it at all, because I was just a tiny baby circus artist, and I came up to you, and I think I'm particularly not memorable because I said to you, "Thank you so much for casting so many women in your work." And you said to me, "That's what everybody says. It's not a remarkable thing. I just cast acrobats that I like to work with." And
it's true.
Like, oh, that's
it's true.
That's a fair point. Yeah, no. It took me a minute to kind of like, it took me a couple of years actually to really understand what you meant by that. But yeah, where does this gender blind policy? Philosophy? Where does it come
literally from? A kind of blindness. I just don't. I mean, there are shows you do peep show and you put somebody in. They have a role that they're doing a strip routine. Generally, they're probably going to be either male or female, depending on that particular number. Like there are times when I can make myself see gender, but most of the time I just don't care. It seems to me the least interesting thing about it. I have no interest in whether or not you are wearing pants or a skirt right now. I don't. Like it just doesn't matter to me how you identify or what you do or what color your skin is or who you believe in. I'm really only interested in this thing that happens inside you, your energy, your presence, your personality, your spirit. And does that have are you generous and open and tough enough to work with a group of people who do that? If you are, then there's a sort of accounting part where you go, we've just suddenly got too many men or women or whatever's bases, and with this, we cast that whole show. There's three aerial acts in the show and there's no aerialists in it. Drat. Better rethink that. Like there are points where you go, we have to error correct or set a bandwidth. But fundamentally, I just we probably, forgive me, but I'm imagining it was probably in a foyer at Tohu somewhere or in.
Absolutely. Yes.
So when we met in a foyer in Tohu, I was not walking around going, I wonder who are the men or who are the women or who are the rich people or who are the Jews here. I'm walking around going, I'm in a room full of human beings and there are going to be some interesting ones and I'm going to, and also I feel shy and insecure and I don't like crowds. So I'm probably going to hang on the end. Maybe I'm going to be drunk. Like that's probably what happens in that kind of environment. So to then kind of abstract that back to you cast a lot of something, to my mind, it just ignores the human reality of it. But where I think we have a lot of work to do on diversity in our casting. It's not been a strong suit of ours because it's so hard to find people anyway who want to do the work and who are good at the work. We had a performing humans on a European tour who was of North African descent, and having a strong black-skinned person on stage was fantastic. Like it just, like your eyes wept with relief that you weren't watching all these white people. For me, it's a really big challenge for us as a company. I think so. We're starting a second ensemble based up in Cairns, which is about 2-hour flight north from here. We'll be 5 permanently employed, 5 full-time acrobats. It's got a young First Nations lead creative on it, and half or more than half the company will be First Nations artists. And we're hoping that will, in the short term, will obviously increase the diversity in the ensemble. But in terms of what lands up on main stage and Circa, we're hoping it becomes a feeder and a training ground, because I think that's an area where you have to kind of just work a bit harder, because I cannot see whether you're male or female. I find it hard. It's very clear that there's things you're not seeing just because they're not there, because there aren't suitably trained.
Right.
And that, I think, is a huge challenge for us.
I have to wonder what it means to be suitably trained. As you're saying, like you can take someone who has no business being on a circus stage, but would be entirely appropriate for Circa.
Yeah, there's a base level of like control and abandon. There's a base level of kind of skill. We can accommodate in our bigger shows a few people who are newer or fresher, but there's a limit to that. If we end up getting, doing bad shows and nobody wants to book us because we didn't bring work of adequate quality to stage, that doesn't help anybody. There won't be anyone to employ people very much longer if that's the case. We have to perform to survive. So we have to balance that pretty carefully. Uh, my instinct is that circus in Australia, which is where we mainly draw our artists from, is essentially largely a class thing. Children of immigrants, for instance, don't go and study circus. They go and study on the whole, and I was one of these. I was expected to be a doctor or a lawyer, and it's only when your kind of family gets to a level or your intergenerational wealth and kind of comfort and that you feel like you've got the room to go. And that's obviously very different to a lot of traditional circus, a lot of the immigrant circus community that has a very different socioeconomic profile. But the Circus University is historically, it's white, it's upper middle class. Harley, who's leading the Circa Cairns Ensemble, is only the second First Nations artist ever to graduate from the National Institute of Circus Arts. To give you an idea about how hard it is to find people who can do that. You know what I mean? Like there's just a sample set size. Like where there's just not like for us to find.
I don't know. I'm excited for you though to go into the streets of Rio de Janeiro and cast from there. Or,
I would love it. Do you want to do a scouting tour for us?
Absolutely.
I think part of it is actually
give me a
bandwidth.
budget. I got you. What's that?
Yeah, I think part of it is like organizational bandwidth, like being able to send people out, as you say, to the streets of Rio de Janeiro. I'm sure there's someone on that street. Do they want to come to Australia? Can we support them? Can we find them? One of the most talented Aboriginal Australian artists that I really was desperate to work with. We both agreed at the time we were unable to support them in our touring model. We just didn't have the cultural infrastructure to ensure that they we could have looked after their mental health, and there was no point putting them in a position where they would fail. The artist subsequently has, thanked me. We both acknowledge it was the right thing to do, even though I really wanted them, they really wanted to work, and they would have been great in the work. We couldn't have supported them with where we were as a company. That's not a source of excuse making. It's a source of there's clearly a lot of work we have to do, and until our circus looks like our world and is as diverse and as rich and as pluralistic as that, then we haven't done our job. And I think that's a kind of, that's just on us. We've got to fix it.
I mean, I think the first step is a recognition of. So
yeah, no, I agree.
Sounds like you're on a good path.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. But it does connect in my mind to the female thing, which is to go really on a level of gender. That is, I think, a thing we passed decades ago. Like I just, and that's not to say that sexuality and relations between genders are not important on stage, because they absolutely are. I'm much more interested in it's what Walter Benjamin calls the primal erotic relationship between distance and closeness. And I think that there is this kind of erotic space that is constantly it's like the strong force that attracts subatomic particles. We're constantly in these kinds of dances and wrestles and attractions and repulsions with people in our lives all the time. And I think that is a very important part of what makes theatre. We come to see those forces made visible and amplified. So I'm not uninterested in sexuality and gender and people. I just don't see it written via which bits people were and weren't born with or have chosen to have.
Yeah, but no, and that's an interesting distinction, because it is very clear from your work that there's a lot of subversion of gender norms and gender roles that happen.
Well, it's a subversion. It's just who we are. I mean, I love that dirty old Freud talked about, early on about being polymorphously perverse. That's what a baby is. We learn to be unperverse. We learn to be civilized. We channel our drives into things that make us respectable.
Sigmund Freud was a famous psychologist and cigar lover at the beginning of the 20th century who coined, among many terms, the term polymorphously perverse, which means to find sexual gratification in activities that aren't even close to what we normally think is getting down and dirty. According to Freud, we're all polymorphously perverse until about age 5 when we discover our genitals and then start consciously limiting what gets us all tingly in our between me down there's. But subconsciously, who knows?
All you have to do is just kind of give that a little bit of air, scratch it a bit, trouble it a bit, put it into a side thing, and where, you know, it's not long before you're having a very different conversation. I don't need to kind of twist it or play with it. I mean, there's shows that do a peep show, like our post cabaret work, which is entirely based for me in the fact that the least sexy thing in the world is somebody trying to be sexy, and that young and
It's
that,
so
that
true.
really attractive young women with extraordinary bodies shouldn't feel the need to put on lingerie in order to get other people to admire them. There's no reason they can't put on lingerie, but it shouldn't be the base standard. So if I'm going to submit, like, that's a very conscious attempt in my mind. It's like why I hate cabaret, because it's really obvious and it puts people in gender and sexual roles that they shouldn't have to be in order to be beautiful and amazing and sexy. And that just shouldn't be what happens. And it strikes me as being so old-fashioned and conservative that I'm just not interested. I want to break it.
Yeah.
And I have the medium because people still come along and like the fact that that's what they look at, but then I can do all sorts of things with it.
Circa, again, I mean, it was funny at the beginning of this interview, you said I run this little circus company called Circa. And I kind of chuckled because relative to many circus, I would say most circus companies, Circa it's a machine.
Well, inside here, it's maybe it feels like that from the outside. Inside, it feels like an awful lot of people running around scrambling to make things happen and keep it floating. But anyway, thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess that's it's an excellent illusion you've got going on then. And my question was going to be about the business aspect of it. How does it grow?
My aim is to get smaller.
Huh.
I have no dynastic ambitions. I don't want to create millions of shows and millions of things. We, as a company, we are very lucky in Australia. We receive some significant amount of government funding. That government funding is depends on the year, but it's usually about 20% of our turnover. So we have to make 70 to 80% of our money, which coming from Australia is quite a challenge. And because we pay people all year round, regardless of whether we work or don't work, every year we start between what we need to keep the company going and what it takes to pay everyone. We start about $1.5 million behind. We have to do about 15 things that make us about $100,000, which could theoretically be a month's touring, but a month's touring for a mid-scale show that clears $100,000 is becoming increasingly quite complex and rare because the touring market is mostly dead and static. So we have to stay busy. We can make money doing creations. We can make money doing commercial seasons of things, touring shows, and running ancillary programs, and some of our engagement work can sometimes make a bit. But mostly it's kind of trying to figure out how to build enough scale so you don't have to worry about scale. Rather than scale's not an end, it's a kind of, if once we get to 20 odd artists with a couple of room for a few people to be off and injured and on leave and stuff, you can field 2 companies of 10 or a company of 10 at 2 and a 7 or 8 fairly easily, or you can augment. So we've got, for instance, in April this year, we have a company in Europe. We have a company doing on a national tour. We have a company in Singapore, and then the national tour company comes and splits and does 2 different shows over a week. We do 16 performances over a week in a commercial theatre in Sydney, and one of those is a world premiere as a new creation. Oh, and we have an engagement project out in Orange in regional New South Wales. So, you know,
maybe you give the illusion of being large because you're just so damn busy.
Yeah. I mean,
I'm just like,
none of this stuff is particularly big. But yeah, I mean, I'd say all of that work would take significantly less money.
But a lot of little is a lot, right?
A lot of little is no, I think that's right. But I think in a way, don't you think, like, if you put it into perspective, I imagine 1 week on a Cirque show would turn over more than we're going to turn over a month easily. Like, it's not, you know what I mean? It's not actually big. What interests me is that the work is authentic and interesting, that the people are engaged, kind of intellectually, physically, emotionally committed to the work, that we have the right people, that we're finding a connection with the audience, They were saying things that are important or useful or joyous or whatever it is that we're kind of grappling with, and that we're moving forward. I would like to be doing somewhat less. I'd like to be doing it a lot better. I'd like it to be having more impact and range. We tend to move fast, so fast we tend to forget to tell people what we've done, or kind of forget sometimes to celebrate it from ourselves. And I'm, as you can tell, fairly sort of practical, and I don't generally like to make a big deal about stuff. I like to just kind of do it and move on.
You mentioned earlier that every show is predicated on questions that were inspired by the previous show.
Yeah.
What are the questions that are in the new show?
Yeah. So at the moment, the new show is, the new show is based on finding alternatives to ensemble acrobatics. It's based on me wanting to really look at intimacy and at relationships. It's based on me being interested in class. So it's unlike most circus shows, it's kind of costumed. Like there's people that go from looking like they're kind of on the streets to being in tuxedos with quite a subtle gradation between them. And watching somebody who's wearing a hoodie doing a acrobatic sequence with somebody who's wearing a tuxedo is very different to watching two people in tuxedos, which will happen in the same show. It's not
so interesting. Yeah.
It's kind of blind and then has this stuff added on top. It's quite rich. It's based on kind of detailed duets. I was really interested in, because we're doing a lot of things that had movement, I was really interested in stillness. I was interested in holding stillness and holding time, which I found our artists were really bad at. And ensemble, in group acrobatics, you just kind of keep moving around. At some point it looks interesting. But if you have to stand on stage with somebody else and just hold, how long can you hold? What is that? Like the charge in a Tesla coil. Like how long do you build before the electricity strikes? And how can you hold that without making it all this kind of intense looking over your shoulders, young people,
yes, the longing
acting,
stares,
but actually be genuinely present. I was really interested in, could we make a show that was about maturity of relationships? I feel like the two things that most circus allows you to do, most contemporary circus allows you to do, is you can fuck or you can fight, but there's often not a lot that happens between them. And I really wanted to find, could I show in the course of, for instance, a single duet, everything from mundanity, repetition, hope, aspiration, disappointment, the flicker of the reignition of a charge between people. So I based the show on 5 or 6 extended duets, which I made to a song, and I set each one to a different song that I chose, which are not the music that the audience will hear, but they gave me a kind of structure for knowing there was a chorus. It wasn't ever like set in like we're going to do this on the chorus, but there was a sense of knowing these were words that I wanted to pick out. This was some of the repetition. This was the bridge, or this was something. So they have a kind of structure that you can't pick from the outside. You're watching. It's like watching an apartment block, watching into the windows of all these different relationships and couples and people move between them. That's not what happens on stage. I would love an apartment block, but I don't have one. So just on a stage, but you get the sense of looking into the stories of people's lives, which is completely the opposite to group acrobatics, to the human shows, for instance, where you feel like you're watching essentially abstracted bodies moving with a kind of united pulse. So this was very much working with stillness, working with relationship, working with nuance between people, was completely different, but all questions that were kind of asked by humans 2.0. And in some ways, Circa, which pushed things in a different direction, but sits in those three works sit kind of together in some ways.
What advice would you give to yourself at the beginning of your career?
Great question. I feel like I continually give myself advice to try and figure out where my fear comes from, and to be able to use it but not be hampered by it, and not be crushed by it but not ignore it. I think that it's easy to go through life with a shell, and that's fine, but it's not what artists do. I think you have to be an artist, you have to live your life with a few layers of skin on you, and that's a difficult way to live. I wish I'd got out more when I was young. I wish I'd had different kinds of experiences, I suppose.
What does that mean?
Look, I feel like I spent too long in Australia. I spent too long in a small puddle where I could have spent more time encountering things overseas and in other parts of the world. I think I would have loved to have spent more time in places off the beaten track. I tended to go to Berlin or Rome, not to Burkina Faso or, Buenos Aires even. And I think I should have traveled more broadly and more widely and more diversely. I'm always really wary of giving advice, even to myself. I do think that, there's a great old Australian expression that says opinions are like arseholes, everybody has one. I do feel like there's a great kind of clamour for people to feel like they know what to do and know what to say. And I think I'm always much more interested in the question and the doubt and the unpicking. And sometimes, as probably your experience of meeting me in a foyer at Tohu sounded like, it probably made me sound like I was grumpy or I was kind of put out by something or kind of slightly negative. And I don't feel that's actually what I am, but I do feel like we often are surrounded by a lot of self-congratulation and cliches, and neither of them are very helpful. And what I'd really like to do is to, encourage myself and others to have the courage to stay fresh and to follow our own kind of instincts and passions rather than to do things that we're expected to do, and just to kind of have courage. Because, courage comes from the same word that heart comes from. Comes from the French.
The cœur.
Okay, that's where courage comes from. And I think that courage combines both a sense of audacity and a sense of love, a sense of belief and a sense of your heart. And I think that's right.
That's beautiful. Yaron Lifschitz, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, giving me another chance to encounter you and have a great time.
Well, I hope next time I'm less dismissive and you will. So I'm gonna aim to.
To be honest, I think you had every right to be quite dismissive. There was really no reason. I don't know.
No nonsense. I mean, I do honestly feel like I should really have a sign. I should really wear a T-shirt that just says, "I am an introvert and guarantee you that I am more uncomfortable in this foyer than you are." Because I do think that it'd solve an awful lot of problems.
That's so good. Something that I've learned during the pandemic is that I'm an extrovert. I think everybody in the world knew it but me. And so I had to come to terms with that.
So I find you alone in a bathroom as an extrovert you're doing that very well.
Well, thank you. Thank God I'm talking to someone.
All right. Talk to you, Anton. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Likewise. Thanks for listening, friends, fans, and foes. I'll talk at you next week. In the meantime, go to patreon.com/theartistathlete and show some love, send some support. Just like these fine Patreons that you're about to hear the voices of right now. The Artist Athlete podcast is supported solely by donations from people like you. Here's what some of those people have to say.
Hi, my name is Noah and I do hand balancing. Hi, my name is Woody and I do Leo walk. Thank you for listening to the Artist Athlete podcast.
Hi everyone, I'm Dominique, a ground acrobat, trapeze artist, and coach, currently bringing circus to the extremely cold but very beautiful Northern Ontario, Canada. Circus has changed my life and I'm so grateful to everyone in this community. Find me on Instagram at DomUpsideDown or my website domupsidedown.com.
Aloha, my name is Beth Russell and I live on the beautiful island of Maui, Hawaii. I am an aerial artist and movement instructor specializing in chakra yoga to keep me balanced and grounded. I play with silks, trapeze, lyra, rope, acro, aerial yoga and dance, slacklining, pole, bungee, and climbing. Really anything that goes up and allows me to explore 3D space. You can find my dedicated aerial page on Instagram at Maui Aerialist. If you find yourself coming to Maui, let's play.
Hey there, friends, fans, and enemies. This is Chris Alston, Patreon of the Artist Athlete podcast, a straps artist and lyra performer and acrobat out of Greenville, South Carolina. So if you're ever passing through, make sure to stop in and see me and my friends. We have a wonderful space, and we'd love to see you.
Hi, my name is Erica Lee. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, and I'm an aerialist. I teach performing arts to elementary school during the day and do pole and swing and rope by night. I really like the Artist Athlete podcast because it gives me a lot of circus goals to look forward to. It gives me a lot of insight on what's going on around the world in circus, and that's why I'm Patreon.
Hello all. Thank you for tuning in to the Artist Athlete podcast. I am Opal Schwartz from Minneapolis, Minnesota. If you're ever in the cities, feel free to stop by the Aviary Minneapolis. It's a great time. With that, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week, and goodbye.
Hey there, artists and athletes. This is Andy Smith, owner and artistic director at Saltaire Circus School in Jacksonville Beach, Florida. And I want to thank you for contributing to the Artist Athlete podcast. If you ever find yourself down in Florida, come check us out. Whether you're an artist, athlete, or someone ordinary just looking to be extraordinary, we got a place for you.